Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the UC Berkeley Arts and Humanities faculty discussing recent work with a colleague. Today, we're very happy to welcome two distinguished guests with ties to the Berkeley community in an event co-sponsored with the German department. Paul Reitter is professor of Germanic languages and literatures at The Ohio State University. Chad Wellmon is professor of German studies and history at the University of Virginia. They will be in conversation with Professor Karen Feldman, the chair of German at Berkeley, about their new book, Permanent Crisis: The Humanities in a Disenchanted Age. Before I turn things over to our guests, let me say a word about upcoming events. Next week, we'll be welcoming Professor Michael Lucy of the Department of French, talking about his new book, What Proust Heard. And I remind you as we move toward next month that on April 27th and 28th, we'll be welcoming Professor Saidiya Hartman of Columbia University. She'll give the Avenali Lecture in the Humanities on April 27th, that's Wednesday. And on the 28th, Thursday, she'll be in conversation with Professor de Bharati Sanyal of the French department at Berkeley. So that's a very special event, and I encourage everyone to join us then. Please feel free to consult our website for a full calendar of events sponsored through the Townsend Center. Now, as we turn to today's event, let me remind you that our guests will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience. So please use your chat function to transmit your questions. So now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Karen, Paul, and Chad. Welcome to the Townsend Center.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thanks to Rebecca Egger and everybody else on the Townsend Center team for all the technical and other work on this. And especially thanks to Paul Reitter and Chad Wellmon. So as Tim said, Paul and Chad are our own Berkeley PhDs. This makes this a somewhat unusual book chat. The book Permanent Crisis: The Humanities in a Disenchanted Age, again, is authored by two Berkeley PhDs from our own department here in German. And I'm very pleased that they invited me to be their interlocutor. Tim already introduced, let me add a little bit. Chad is as Tim said, professor of German studies with appointments in history and media studies at the University of Virginia. And he's co-director of UVA's new curriculum and the principal of Brown College. Chad is the author of Organizing Enlightenment, Information Overload, and the Invention of the Modern Research University, and another book, Becoming Human, Romantic Anthropology and the Embodiment of Freedom. Paul Reitter, as Tim said, is at the Ohio State University and has also been director of the Humanities Institute there. Paul has written a book entitled Bambi's Jewish Roots, Essays on German Jewish Culture. And he has also written a book entitled The Anti-Journalist Karl Kraus and Jewish Self-Fashioning in Fin de Siècle Europe. And Paul's currently working on a new translation of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. Paul and Chad have previously collaborated with each other, co-editing a source book on the rise of the research university and on Nietzsche's 1872 lectures on the German educational system. And they together co-edited also Charisma and Disenchantment, the Vocation Lectures by Max Weber. So my next step is to give my own 5-minute or so summary of the argument of this book. And Chad and Paul, I want you to correct it as you like and refine it. And then I want to come back to several main points of the book, of course, with questions to you. What I want to communicate to start with is, this is a pretty provocative book. This is even a polemical book. And I want to be sure to spend enough time on the polemic, because I can imagine there will be very different views about some of the things you say in this book. But to start with, my summary goes like this. The book is about the history of the humanities in its various historical manifestations from 14th century Italy onward, but it is largely focused on 19th century Germany and has an important last chapter about current discussions of the humanities in the USA. The book is a set of stories about different stretches of time and different thinkers. In other words, it's written in a narrative mode, recounting various moments in the history of what we call the humanities. But the narrative serves some very clear and specific arguments. Some of those arguments are, first, that the humanities, as we define them, has been produced and conceived in a range of ways. And the history of what we call the humanities is heterogeneous and disjunctive in large parts. The contemporary humanities is not continuous with various past phenomena that we might see as its precursors, for instance, the Studia Humanitatis. So Chad's and Paul's anti-essentialist historical narrative, that's my phrase, not theirs, that anti-essentialist historical narrative, in my view, is its least controversial element. The points about the discontinuity and disjunction of the history of the humanities, in my view, is fairly easily assimilated. So I want to get to some of the more controversial points. The book also contains a history of laments and worries that we hear a lot from academics today, and in particular in the humanities, but also in other disciplines. So they show that various laments are not new, including these laments. Our society has lost a sense of what really matters. Universities are too much managed like corporations. Universities are too focused on professional training. Universities offer a chaos of course offerings without providing meaningful orientation. Again, in each case, Paul and Chad show that these are old laments. These are not unique to our time. Knowledge at the university in general is too disparate and should somehow be unified. Universities should form students' moral character, but doesn't do this adequately or at all. Universities should transmit knowledge and methodology, but they don't do this adequately or at all. And the university, in its education and especially in the humanities, should compensate for the alienation effects of industrialization and technicization on our lives. I found it especially even amusing how some of these old complaints, or how old some of these complaints are. Adolf Diesterweg, a 19th century German educator, serves in the book as an allegory of sorts about complaints about university education. He wrote a book that the title translates as The Rot at German Universities. He says that the university should form character and teach critical thinking, and fails at both. Because he writes of the superficiality of the times, and he writes because professors aren't hired for their teaching skills, and enrollments are too high, and professors know that publishing is what will produce professional advancement. He adds, the professors don't care if their students are sleeping in class, and there's no community of scholars, just individual researchers doing their own thing. So those are the laments. The book then also, at the same time, investigates several what it portrays as defensive characterizations of the humanities, and looks at how they come into being in various forms. For instance, the humanities understood as a method cultivating erudition, knowledge. The humanities as a process of character formation and moral edification. The humanities as an inculcation into a distinct cultural tradition. The humanities should serve to elevate us over animals, specifically with regard to our autonomy. And the humanities serve as a compensation for a loss of investment in religion. Now, in narrating this history of the humanities, and especially the German Research University, Chad and Paul make a series of claims that I would call, the book doesn't call them this, but I am calling dialectical claims about the humanities. They have some very provocative comments like the processes of democratization, secularization, and bureaucratic rationalization make liberal education possible, even as they imperil it. And I'll come back to this one. Another, what I consider dialectical account, modernization enables and threatens a neo-humanist project of education. And our present day university embodies long-standing conflicts between the demand to form character, to inculcate values, as with the American college tradition that, as they describe, was based on religious denominations, So a conflict between that demand to form character and the demand to produce research, which requires an orientation not determined by values, but by various epistemological frames. And we talk today, this is maybe the largest claim, we talk today about a crisis of the humanities, but Chad and Paul argue through their narratives that the humanities always were formed in response to a sense of crisis and even depend in their origination and perpetuation on that sense of crisis. In that vein, my last point here, connected to what I'm considering these dialectical analyses, the book, as I've already said, is a polemic. It has some statements that will most likely not be happily embraced by some humanists. For instance, it makes statements about what it calls the peevishness, self-servingness, and overpromising and lack of historical perspective in what it calls the modern humanities crisis talk. So now that's my summary. Let me start with a first question, and you can also, of course, Chad and Paul, respond to my summary, because maybe you will perceive that summary as failing or lacking in certain respects. I first want to ask, though, about the form of the book. It's really readable and engaging. It is because the argument is presented in a narrative that it's so readable, that the story develops with the argument. So I want to ask about the story you're telling, how you got into telling it this way, and of course you can correct my representations and talk more about what you perceive as the main arguments there.
Paul, you wanna start?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for that. I think it does what you just said an injustice to call it a summary, because it has a lot of analytic content to it as well. I mean, I feel like we can just go home now or open it up to questions, since you have evoked so successfully.
Don't worry, Paul. I took copious, almost verbatim notes, so we're
okay,
good.
Good. Yeah, we'll have to reuse that. But really, Karen, thank you so much for being our interlocutor today, and also for that really amazing account of the book. And we appreciate your engagement, and thanks to the Townsend Center for inviting us into the German department for co-sponsoring. It's really nice to stay connected with Berkeley, and I've enjoyed that a lot over the years, and I'm really happy that this is happening. As to the narrative element of the book, I would say that there was always a sense in our question or in our approach of how did we get here exactly? To tell, I guess, the story of the book in a kind of narrative form, or to approach it briefly in narrative form. I was the director of the Humanities Institute at Ohio State from 2012 to 2017. And one of the first things that happened when I became director was that people started asking, are we in crisis? That is, are we humanists in crisis? Is there a crisis in the humanities, of the humanities? And I felt that I didn't really have such a great answer. And so I started to kind of look around at accounts of the crisis of the humanities. And I was mostly dissatisfied by what I saw, sometimes kind of frustrated and annoyed at the same time. And that's perhaps where some of the polemical content comes from, although I think in some ways that we are less polemical in our treatment of crisis talk than a lot of other people, because there's a lot of dismissiveness about crisis talk in accounts of the crisis of the humanities, which often say, oh, this previous crisis talk is overblown, but now I'm going to diagnose the crisis of the humanities, and I'm going to say that it's happening now in our present, claiming for oneself the position of a person who's in the eye of the storm and kind of pushing other people away from it, and saying that what they dealt with was less significant. So there's, a self-importance to that gesture, among other things. In any case, so that's how the question became, in a way, very urgent for me. And we had already, by that time, 2012, started to work on our source book, a book of an anthology of sources having to do with the organization of the research university. And from that, from reading these early 19th century texts about the organization of research university, and Chad had already started working on his Organizing Enlightenment book, we both were very clear about the fact that this sense of crisis is very long-standing. And what we wanted to do then was tell the story of, how you get from that early crisis to the crisis of the present day, the continuities, the transformations. And at the same time, we wanted to make some strong arguments in response to the polemicizing about the crisis of humanities the crisis of the humanities that was going on around us. Chad, that's
I would just echo your first part, which is, I think for both of us, this is a certain bit of autofiction in the sense that, like Paul, so Paul was doing his institutional formation, creation, defense at Ohio State. And at the same time, I had, for crazy reasons, which I have suppressed now, had agreed to lead this reform of UVA's undergraduate education program. And the thing that struck me in this attempt to do this institutional politics was how opaque and how unintelligible our own institution was to my colleagues here in Charlotte, well, there in Charlottesville at UVA. And I remember this encounter with an undergraduate student, a second year, a young woman. We had one of these cafeteria plans where you take a math, you take a social science, you take a humanities. And she was going down her list and she said, okay, well, I think the only thing I need a humanities. So what's a humanities? And that was, yes, a second year student, but it was also kind of writ large across the faculty, all of the categories within which we had been organized in the university. They made little sense to many of my colleagues. So for me, at least, and I think in a similar way to Paul, this book was an attempt to understand where we were. And I think just given our kind of historical propensities, that was part of it. But it was also an attempt to narrate our own institutions and our own consternations and frustrations with that. So I think that narrative form very much reflects kind of where we both, I don't know if you would put it that way. I mean, you suggested it, Paul, when you were saying directing the institute, but I think that's an essential thing that we completely bracket out of that. But I think the narrative form really is an attempt to try to make sense of our present and the past in that way.
Thanks. Let me ask you, I mean, there are a lot of narratives, of course, written on a lot of books written about the German influence on higher education. And, you do start with Petrarch, but, you focus certainly on 19th century Germany. So I just want to ask you, what your story adds, if you want to explain it. I mean, there are a lot of stories about William Rainey Harper and Mortimer Adler and so forth, but you have things that you add to what's already out there. So I just want to ask you to expand on that.
I think one thing, I don't know so much adding as a giant premise that we either force a reader to accept or to give up right from the get-go, which is, and as you alluded to, wonderfully, Karen, is that at the center of this, at the beginning, center, and end, is this giant caesura between what we call the modern humanities, not as a form of periodization, and all of the attempts to make the humanities stretch across millennia and civilizations, the Studio Humanitatis of kind of the early modern period, the Florentine Renaissance, in our mind, on our account, are rather different projects. And the reason they're different projects is because the institution of the university changed pretty radically over the course of the 19th century in this give and take across the Atlantic in Germany, and then the reception and complete reformulation of these German institutional traditions. And so I think for us, whether, I don't know if it's an addition to the literature or just a premise that we ask our readers to accept, which is the modern humanities are rather distinct from all of the other things that are often dredged up and narrated as this cross-millennial tradition called the humanities, stretching back usually to Greek and Roman antiquity. And then the second thing I would just say is that modern for us is it points, as I suggested, not to, and I think crisis does this in a way for us as well, it points not to a particular period, not even to a particular sociological process, although we relate it to that, but this overwhelming, for good and bad, just like crisis for good and bad, of present-mindedness, right? So the humanities, they're not really recovering anything. They're always setting up something that is, feared to be in danger over against a present threat, whether that's the Prussian state, whether that's technology, whether it's the Soviet Union, in the in the Cold War American university, whether it's professional education or vocational education. The humanities are simply that in ex negativo, right? They're defined as that over against which something sacred, something of meaning and value must be cared for and sustained. And we try, it's generous of you to call it dialectical. I think sometimes we fall off the dialectical horse, but they're good. That's good and bad. I would say.
I would say that one thing that we maybe not add to the conversation, but draw attention to perhaps more forcefully than others have, is some of the tensions within German education and how they made their way into debates about higher education in the US. Very broadly speaking, there is the idea, the quite influential idea, you find it in Gerald Graff professing literature, for example, and elsewhere, that the German tradition was very much, or the German model was very much centered on Wissenschaft, and the American academics who went, or the academics from the US who went to Germany, and the university administrators who went to Germany and found the model there interesting and inspiring, when they came back to the US and tried to transplant this model of Wissenschaft, people who were attached to the traditional college model, which centered on moral education, they often reacted negatively. And then you had this clash between, German Wissenschaft and homegrown, moral, religiously oriented education. And one thing that I think we bring out is that within the German tradition, there was a great deal of discussion about, a great deal of hand-wringing over the tension between Wissenschaft and character formation. And the architects of the modern research university built that tension, among others, into the system, in this system of competing ideals that they developed. Bildung and the formation of character through Wissenschaft. They thought that there was an essential compatibility there, but that there was also tension. And I think that one of the things that we try to show, especially in our last chapter, is how that the discussion of that tension in Germany made its way into the U.S. into the U.S. and contributed to ongoing discussions about the divide between scientific education and moral education. That this was not simply German Wissenschaft and running up against American moral education, but that there was this tension within the German tradition that that made its way to the States and informed this discussion about the tension between these two sides of education.
I would add one more thing, and I think this is implicit in everything we've all said here. We were talking about the humanities, and we're all of a sudden, or at the same time, talking about the university. And I think one of the analytic distinctions that I would want to emphasize, and hopefully it comes through in the book, is that when we talk about the humanities, that's why we qualify them also as the modern humanities, is we see the modern humanities as an institutional project, that project being wrapped up with the research university, and sometimes opposed to, but definitely an analytic distinction from reading practices or philosophical traditions and philosophical practices, or even practices of the natural sciences. And part of the story in my mind is how those practices were captured and monopolized in many ways, but not always, and that's where it gets really interesting, but at least are not identical to a whole range of ways and forms of life and communities of reading literature, reading philosophy, or observing nature. And that is a very recent development. And I sometimes think of it as this book is trying to understand the entailments, that kind of institutional capture, the entailments of that, when forms of reading, particular ways of thinking that do in fact stretch in much broader ways, when they are so captured by one institution.
Thanks. I actually want to ask you more about that, because I think it fits into the theme that you mentioned several times in the book, that the humanities have overpromised, and in different ways at different moments. This is a interesting and possibly contentious claim. You talk about the overpromising, and maybe I think the first big overpromise that you investigate in the book is the overpromise of the unity of knowledge in the earlier 19th century mostly. So, which is, as you point out, related to universal history. This is where you get a lot of the German material, the Schiller, the Schelling, the Schleiermacher, but still in the larger sense, this overpromising or false hope of a unity of knowledge. Can you say more about that and how it fits in exactly with what you're saying, the institutional formation of the humanities exactly in the 19th century?
I'll start off, and one thing I would say is that the overpromising takes a number of registers. One of the first registers I was just rereading this morning for something else, the way Kant, I don't know if we actually discuss it, Kant and the Conflict of Faculties, so 1798, which was a key text for the debates that then would, kind of overwhelm Prussian bureaucrats about the future of a higher educational institution. One of the presuppositions and what the university has to promise is, in fact, that it unifies the disparate parts of what he calls the entire content of Wissenschaft, or the entire content of knowledge. So the university itself, if it's to be organized according to a division of intellectual labor, which is, his argument kind of pushing forward Adam Smith at that point, it has to presuppose the unity of a common object that's worked upon. And that is this unity of knowledge. So the first overpromise, and he says the only way, right, that scholars can have the freedom to which they aspire, that they can conduct themselves as autonomous thinkers, as a corporation attached to the university, if they can claim ownership, as it were, over the truth-seeking and working on this unified object of knowledge. That, I think, is one, that's kind of a first overpromise, even before the University of Berlin, which is established in 1810. So even on a normative level, that overpromise is seen as an institutional necessity on Kant's part for making arguments about academic freedom and the autonomy of scholars to do what they want to do and not be overly determined by the state. Paul, you want to pick up there?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that with regard to the early expressions of the unity ideal in 19th century Germany, in the writings of the architects of the research university, we in a way are trying not to rehabilitate it exactly, but to rescue it from the idea that it was some kind of idealist trope about, how philosophy could unify all knowledge, a self-aggrandizing philosophical idealist trope, and then also a romantic notion as well, the absolute signifier, this kind of thing, and talk about it as a moment in these writings where a sense of crisis is registered, or where a sense of unease about the conditions that are allowing for this transformation of the university, its reinvention as a modern secular institution. And I think that Schleiermacher and Humboldt are impressively clear-eyed early on about the dangers of this kind of development for the ability of scholars to talk to one another across disciplinary divides. And they want there to be a common language. Sometimes it's a fairly simple thing, particularly in the case of Schleiermacher, who is suspicious of certain idealist tropes, and he just wants there to be a kind of unifying method of critical inquiry that everybody speaks, that will allow everybody to speak with one another. But it takes on different resonances at different times over the course of the 19th century. At a certain point, it really starts to resonate with talk about political unity. And it occurs in the context, in fact, of political discussions. You see academic administrators going back and forth between the two things at times. And it also becomes later on a tool used by professors who are worried about the vocationalization of the university to try to fight for what they perceive to be the older Humboldtian idealist model of a university organized around pure science. And so I think we have less sympathy for that instantiation of it.
And in a way, I read Max Weber as the hero of your story, if that can be portrayed correctly, especially his lectures, the 1919, scholarship as vocation. So why don't you explain, why does Max Weber take on this importance in this story? And what Max Weber does for your account of the crisis talk and how it evolves?
Oh, you were the one who chose him as our hero, so you're not just kidding. You do it.
Well, I can begin, and I'll hand it over to Chad after in a couple of minutes. I think that we started with Nietzsche. We did this volume for the New York Review of Books Classics series on the 1872 lectures on the German education system, and we developed some basic parts of our argument in thinking about this material and writing an introduction for it. This idea that the very modern processes that enable the humanities to develop in this new modern way have also always made life difficult for the humanities. In some ways, it's a short step from there to Weber, who of course is a big, theorist of modernization. But we also, I think, now that I'm trying to recall how we got started on the path to presenting Weber as such or treating him as such an important figure. And if I remember correctly, Chad, you can challenge this if you don't think it's right, but we started to read Weber's writings on the university. This is something that maybe is not so well known among people who read Weber, that he was a very active participant in discussions about the university in Germany around 1900, about academic freedom, about hiring practices, about the government's increasing heavy-handedness with respect to academic appointments and other things. And we found these writings very interesting for this general idea that a sense of crisis has persisted throughout the ages, changing, to be sure, in various important ways, but certain elements of it being bearing some striking continuity. And so that really kind of took us into Weber. We were looking at Weber as an example, or someone registering this sense of crisis that we were interested in tracking. And then at a certain point, we realized that he was saying things that helped us understand the phenomenon that he was also embodying. And I'll hand it over to Chad at this point.
Yeah, I would simply add that I think both of those projects, the Nietzsche volume and also the Research University volume, the Nietzsche volume and the Weber volume, were real philological projects. And so I think as we were doing these, we began them, I think, with certain reasons, with certain understandings of what we were doing and why we were doing it. But I think those reasons quickly became something entirely different. I would say, especially for me, in the case of Weber, it first occurred to us, oh, it's the 200th anniversary is coming up soon. And wow, the translations that everybody uses in all their classes, they're not all that great. Oh, and then I didn't realize that, he had been, the speech from 1917 was at the invitation of a group of pretty left, and they became sooner more radically left. Benjamin was one of the affiliates from Berlin, and they wanted to do a series on the future of geistige Arbeit, or intellectual work. So they invited a pastor, an artist, a politician, and they want to invite a scholar. And so Weber turned out was the only one who did it. And then 2 years later, also did the one on politics. And so it was that situation where these students who spoke of the university in these incantatory ways, the university as the apex, and very Humboldtian kind of language of the moral unity of the nation. And Weber was there in the middle of the war, in a way sympathizing with him, but in a way trying to disabuse himself and them, I think, of that overpromising of an entire culture around a particular institution. And so it was the combination of that philological work, but also Weber is offering, in a sense, a coda, like the end of the humanist legacy of Humboldt, which we had a really hard time arguing for, and yet it persisted in such intense cultural and political ways into the first 2 decades in Germany.
Yeah. To add to that, I would say also that, we are, I think it comes across that we admire Weber's speech, Science as a Vocation, and in some ways we agree with it. It's not a prescriptive book, this book, but we do, I think, suggest at certain moments that Weber's way of negotiating the tension between scholarly education and values education has, some real tenability. It makes sense. It's something that could perhaps be used in the present. We also try hard not to, to simply embrace Weber in an uncritical way. And one of the things that I think we both find quite striking in his speech in his 1917 The Scholar's Work speech, more commonly translated as Science as a Vocation, is his fatalism about the academic job market, where he says, this is a really miserable situation, and if you young scholars or aspiring scholars can't deal with the idea of someone much less talented having a much better institutional position, because nowhere is there less meritocracy than in the academic job market, then you should absolutely do something else. He, despite his activist streak with respect to academia, despite his full-throated defenses of academic freedom and his willingness to call out very powerful bureaucrats in the pages of major newspapers, and despite the fact that Germany, of course, had the money to create more regular academic positions, he basically just accepts it as a natural fact that the academic job market is going to be this way. There are a number of things in this speech and elsewhere that we take issue with.
Thank you. I've just one or two things before we start taking some audience questions. I first want to come back to the polemical character of the book, because there is a disparagement in the book of, what you call crisis talk in the humanities. You're already alluding to it. And you really do say that kind of crisis talk is historically uninformed and leads to the humanities and humanists falling into certain defensive postures that are again tied to the overpromising, to say, oh, the humanities teaches values. The humanities teaches critical thinking. The humanities is what, keeps us human in this university with all its science components. The humanities is about human freedom. And you see these as not as incorrect per se, but as problematic, in my reading, problematic defensive positions. So I just want to ask you about that, because I mean, these are positions that I hear around when people are arguing about budgets and, maintaining or increasing humanities budgets, or new hires or new programs, as enrollments in the humanities in certain areas especially suffer. So, you have a certain disparagement for this crisis talk, and yet this is talk that oftentimes in its rhetoric, in its exhortative mode, seems important to humanists to be able to keep the strength of what we do in the university that is under neoliberal pressure. So I wanted to ask you more about the polemical part of it and how you sort of see yourselves. And have you lost any friends over this? I'm sort of wondering, because there's some sharp language in there about some of the humanities defenses.
I just think it's all wrong is the first answer. I think, the claims that the humanities, make better democratic citizens, that they form better souls, they make people empathetic, they're overblown, they're repetitive, and I think ultimately ineffective. And I think part of the account that we try to, for a whole number of reasons, but part of the account that I think we try to offer here is that they're also an institutional trap, because what it does, it puts the burden, these massive burdens of moral judgment, of empathy cultivation, all of these things that are like social necessities, not only on one institution like the university, but also on one very small but functional part of the university, but and thus also excuses all the rest of the university from that kind of labor, the emotional, the democratic cultivation labor. So part of it is kind of on its own merits. I don't think that's what, quote, the humanities effectively do. But two, how the modern research university has functionalized those arguments, kind of offloaded them, as it were, so you can keep them nice and collective and manageable in one part of the university, and thus excuse the rest of the university from having to engage in ethical reasoning of any sort. I think those are two kind of the broader claims. One, I just don't believe that they work, because I think what people call the humanities are what I prefer to think of as particular intellectual practices, whether it's philology in its myriad forms, whether it's certain forms of historical reasoning. I think those are intellectual practices. Their products are knowledge, and they definitely have ethical forms. They presume certain kinds of virtues, certain kinds of epistemic and even moral ideals about what a good philologist does, for example. But as to whether they can constitute a body politic or any of the other grandiose overpromises, I think that's an entirely different question. And I think it's a much bigger question than a literature department or a history department. So yeah, it's polemical. It's probably even more polemical in person, I would, because I think Paul and I maybe disagree about some of the things too.
I think that and let me know, my internet connection is acting up a little bit, so just let me know if I'm freezing up, please, so that I know to stop talking to myself. But I think that, Chad, as a matter of personal style, you tend to be a little more combative in these discussions than I am. I think we
functionalize our relationship too. So I play the bad cop, bad humanities cop.
It's good. Balance, we complement each other. We don't want to both be doing exactly the same thing. Well, I would say that on the one hand, and I gestured at this early in the discussion, on the one hand, I think that we take crisis talk more seriously than a lot of people do, because one of the things we're trying to show here is how profoundly crisis talk has shaped the development of the modern humanities. And there are moments in the book, like with Wilhelm Dilthey, for example, responding to the physicist Hermann Helmholtz by using an epigraph from Helmholtz in his Dilthey's pioneering Einleitung in die Geisteswissenschaften, or Introduction to the Humanities, what is how is Geisteswissenschaften translated aside from humanities? There's another, the human sciences, Introduction to the Human Sciences. In this book, I mean, this is a response to this sense that maybe the sciences are claiming too much. What can the humanities do to compete? And in the pressure of this moment, Dilthey comes up with some really pioneering and influential formulations for what it is the humanities can do. And so we're not suggesting that crisis talk is all overblown and that crisis in general, or feeling yourself to be in a crisis position and responding to that, is necessarily unproductive. But we do have some criticisms of contemporary crisis discourse in the humanities for sure. And one of them does indeed have to do with overpromising, which stretches the credibility of humanists and also, of course, sets them up for failure. We think that it's better as a matter of strategy to recognize certain limitations than just like throw out these claims about how we can have mass Bildung for everyone, when there's a lot of evidence that suggests that certain kinds of humanistic education just don't scale very well. And there is, in fact, tension between democratization and humanities education, and trying to bury that and run from it, which is a fairly new phenomenon. People in the 70s, Lionel Trilling was talking about this tension, and Arendt talked about the tension as well. That's not a good thing, and it of course is important to be able to inspire people. And one result of somewhat inflated discourse of what the humanities can do is that when you turn around and enumerate things that you think the humanities can do, big things, important things, they might fall a little flat, because people are used to the soul building talk. We had a conversation just around the time the book came out with one of the editors of the Chronicle of Higher Education, who was nice enough to interview us about the book. And when I said that I think that the humanities can, do some of the things that Weber was talking about, help people, and not just the humanities, other academic disciplines can do this, but help people to think critically, to reflect critically on their values, on the social effects of their values, to serve, therefore, as a kind of mediator of values, to help people develop certain values that are important for humanistic study on a high level, and other kinds of study as well. Independent-mindedness and listening to others, tolerance about diversity of opinion, these things, which I think are, so crucial things. His response was, "Oh, okay, so you're for like a minimalist version of the humanities, because I'm not there claiming that, we're going to just transform people's lives." But that is transformative stuff. It's just maybe quietly transformative. And
well, I have a question about transformative quality,
yes.
If I may interrupt you, sorry.
Please.
And this is a planted question by one of your former mentors, speaking of transformations. Berkeley German PhDs, with this wonderful book and other wonderful work that you've done. How did your time at Berkeley shape what you're doing now? Did something that you did in our program here at Berkeley German department, did it take you there? Just, you don't have to be long with this, because I do want to ask at least a couple audience questions, but it was planted. I was instructed to make this point from your former mentors.
It definitely did, and it continues to. So in the book I'm writing right now, it's called After the University, and it's primarily a history. It's primarily an attempt to reckon with the current kind of intellectual conditions through a study of the UC system in the middle of the 20th century, and it's again, like kind of the auto fiction of this is all of my first teaching, right? The first time I stepped into a classroom was in comp lit or in the German department at Berkeley. And I remember the first student who ever came to office hours was a 23 or 24-year-old woman from Southern California who had just transferred to Berkeley. And she and her classmates asked, well, I don't understand. So why is Hamlet on the syllabus? And so that I'll leave the anecdote there, and simply to say the way it transformed me was to think institutionally about these things and to think of education and these transformative experience in the context of this kind of historical place that really did attempt to democratize access to so many of these traditions, which I still do love and deeply care about, and all of the beauty, but also all of the misery that came along with that. So for me, it was that kind of legacy of institutionalization that I'm only now, I think, trying to reckon with.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it for me as well. That at Berkeley, you have a shiny example of the difficulty of some of these things that we're talking about, like delivering high quality humanistic education to a broad swath of the population. And clearly, today there's a great deal of hand-wringing over this. Can we expand the student body to cover our costs? And obviously, I'm referring to this legal case that has rekindled this discussion that has never really gone out. So some of these tensions that we're interested in the book are very apparent at Berkeley, and we weren't thinking about them necessarily in the terms we are in the book, but that was part of it. As to the question about the German department in Berkeley, I would say that we were encouraged to try to do different kinds of scholarship and not simply to be literary scholars if we had other inclinations, and I appreciate that. And I think that it has, I can't speak for Chad, but for me, that has stuck with me, and I have tried to act on that advice and follow my inclinations. And then also, there were a number of people in the department who were very committed to a certain tradition of hermeneutic thinking and critical theory, and these things are important in the book in various ways, both as primary and secondary, primary material and secondary lenses.
Thank you. Here's a question I have from an audience member. You're talking in grand terms about the humanities, about American universities and German universities, but the American university system is extraordinarily diverse. Many small liberal arts colleges generate knowledge, but also transmit values. Large universities like Berkeley are currently quite aggressive about the values underpinning their mission. Could you talk about the different kinds of models in the American context?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the first distinctions, or one of the big distinctions you would want to make between the kind of the German traditions and the German traditions of institutions that we talk about. And the last chapter kind of ends kind of before World War II in the US. And in it, for a very specific reason, already by then, American institutions of higher education are radically different from, if you even want to call them that, their German forebears. They had been completely reinvented by the 1862 Morrill Act, right, which land grant institutions, but also remade everything from Harvard and Cornell to MIT. And one of the key transformations kind of in the middle of the 20th century, and just simply to allude and say how right this question is and how insufficient the account that we would give in this book is to this internal differentiation, is the flourishing of community colleges after the war in the US. So you have the grandiose kind of UCs, but also as part of the California master plan, you have just the proliferation of community colleges and state teacher colleges. And the kinds of learning and knowledge that happen there are in some ways similar, but are in some ways very different, and in some ways intentionally very different, right? The master plan, among many things, was a highly stratified organization where basically liberal arts was slotted into and accorded as a purpose up the chain, like more to the UCs. And I think that speaks volumes, right? These kinds of knowledges and these kinds of knowledge practices, in a sense, like who's worthy of them, right? Who can and can't make use of the certain kinds of knowledges that have been grouped under the humanities. So there is a much more, in terms of bringing it up to the present and going over the course of the 20th century, there's a much more complicated and I think really fascinating and really kind of even more polemical and more indicting story to tell about that. And so that's really to just say that that question is right on, and it far exceeds what we try to address in permanent crisis now.
Thanks. Let me follow up, because another question asks if any of the sources you worked on, but just in more general terms, you can respond. Do the sources you work on talk about what we might call social mobility through humanities training? It's this question, about social mobility and what function that serves and how the humanities are connected. This might be our last question.
Paul, do you want to address that, or?
Yeah, I can start. So absolutely, and one of the points we tried to make about the emergence of the modern humanities in the beginning of the 19th century is that it was very much tied to the democratic spirit of the moment, that part of its appeal, its legitimacy came from the idea that this was something that anybody could enjoy. Of course, in practice, it didn't quite work out like that. But some of these architects of the modern research university were from a modest background and talked about in their writings the importance of making sure that universities subsidized meals for students, this kind of thing. So there was definitely an embrace of social mobility, of the inclusivity of a kind, but at the same time there was a certain wariness of making the institution, well, too inclusive. There was this sensitivity to scale, and it can be odd, startling to hear in the early 19th century people complaining about the overexpansion of the university, Diesterweg complaining about large class sizes, because by our standards these were still tiny institutions. But it's all relative, and so they pretty quickly had some concerns about oversubscription. So that's just one example, but it's I think worth mentioning because it gets at how, again, some of the tensions that we're really interested in tracking in this book.
Yeah, and I think another example would be over decades, the Frauenfrage, right? The question of admission of women for degrees, and also Jewish students. I think that is an excellent window into not just social mobility, but again, kind of who was allowed and who was not allowed access to the liberating potential of reason, of higher learning as such. And it all kind of comes out, very explicit statements about what precisely are those goods presumed, to be on offer in this particular institution, and who precisely and why should or should they not be granted access to them. And so it's a very kind of protective, in some ways, it's a very protective, Bildung is a sacred good that shouldn't be sullied. But you get a clear sense, well beyond kind of the abstractions of what I just said about who, why, and when possibly. And so it's not necessarily formulated in terms of social mobility, because that wasn't kind of a political program, but I think today we could read it precisely as that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose this isn't exactly a formulation in terms of social mobility, but there were moments when the presence of students who were not wealthy was perceived as a real potential social threat. Bismarck was kind of obsessed with the idea of an academic proletariat. And one of the reasons why we know so much about enrollment figures in the late 19th century German university is because he kept commissioning statistical analyses of people in different areas and whether they were getting jobs upon graduation.
Great. I am just so pleased to have had this opportunity, and that the Townsend Center made a spot for you guys to talk about your wonderful book, your very fascinating book. And thank you for having me be your interlocutor. Thanks to the Townsend Center, and be well, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen.